Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to be tackling something that I know a lot of people have dealt with in their productions, and that's a straightforward operational way to reframe guests when they are in multi-box shots inside your productions. And that happens for a lot of people where they're just leaning to the side, or they just don't have a good frame because there's too much headroom, or all of those things. We're going to look at a script that works specifically with the Vmix 27 beta to let you do that using a Stream Deck Plus. But before we get to that, I want to welcome everybody. If you have any comments, any questions you want to ask, just post them in the comments on whatever platform, and we'll try to get to them as quickly as possible here on the show. Also, if you'd like to join us live on the show, we do have a call-in link. It's in the show notes. So if you want to join us here live and talk on air, we have a link, and somebody from the studio will get you on. So let's start by having me show you specifically what I am looking to accomplish on today's show. So you've had lots of examples where you've had to, take a multi-box shot of guests, and you have some guests that are just sitting there and they're not really well lined up. So let's just take the guest in layer 2 here. So if I wanted to, I can actually take and make adjustments to sort of slide them over and get them exactly how I want to see them. I could even zoom them in a little bit, maybe if I wanted to sort of create similar headroom. So things like that. And we're actually doing that just using this, where if I want to, I can go and, as I said, I just sort of changed positioning here, changed the zooming a bit here to make those adjustments. So we have this all happening through a simple control surface, and all I need to do is select which layer, but in this case, these match up to guests. So if I want to do layer 1, I could slide layer 1 around and get that centered the way I want. Layer 3, same thing, where I'm just doing whatever I want on a layer by layer basis. So this is what we're going to be tackling on today's show. So before I dive into that, I think we got some comments in here. So let me sort of go through all this. We have Aziz. Aziz, it's great to see you here. Thank you. I appreciate you joining us. Spatial, as always. Hello back. Michael, thank you for joining. Good evening to you as well. So, JP, the time change is always a little tough, and I apologize. We're just trying to work through this as best we can with everyone. So R2 Broadcast, hello. Thank you for joining us, R2. I appreciate it. Oh, so Mian Muhammad Hassan, thank you. I appreciate that. It's great to have you join us here. And you the man, great to see you. Thank you for joining. Oh, and Obsessive Audio. Welcome back, Obsessive. Thank you for joining us from Toronto. Great to have you. And Michael, that's a neat trick. Yeah, so we'll go through, because in the post show, I'll talk a little bit about what it took to get all this set up. But it was sort of fun to figure this one out. Okay, so I think the place to start is understanding some of the logic that Vmix has when you want to work with placing things on screen, cropping them, zooming them, all of that. So I'm going to switch over here, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the different values that are involved and how these all relate to each other. So the first thing that sits on top of all of this is the size of the session itself. So it's like 1920 for us, 1920 by 1080. So it's a standard 1080p style layout. And we need that because certain things we need to calculate based on the full width of, we'll call it the canvas that we're working on. So that's sort of the session canvas, the session layout on the screen. But there are a lot of other elements that are in here that we need to talk about. So let me go down here and sort of show you here. This is your typical layer. So under an input, an overlay is the layers that stack up under an input. So the first thing you have, and this is shown in the interface if you're positioning something in a layer, is what they call pan X and pan Y. So the way panning works is that you have a center point in the screen, and you take and say, it's just sort of a scalar vector. So it says I'm either going up or down, so it has a plus or a minus, and it basically divides things to say I'm going 1, which is sort of halfway across the screen in a positive direction or negative, or 2, which is fully off the screen. So this is sort of based on the center point of whatever it is you're moving, which is why you have that sort of, I move it, 1 moves the center point from the center all the way to the edge of the screen, and then moving it 2 takes that center point and moves it all the way off the screen so the left edge is no longer visible in the canvas area. So that's what these do. So these go from -2 to +2. And that's just telling you where to slide this layer across the canvas. The next thing is zoom. And zoom is it's really a multiplier, just another type of, I guess you'd call it a scalar. And the way that works is that 0 is like 0 zoom. There's no image. I zeroed it away. You can't really go there. It stops at some lower number, and you still always have something on screen. But then 1 means no zoom. So it's a multiplier. It says take where your size and multiply it by this. So 1 is no zoom, and then 2, 3, 4, and it goes up to 5. That just gives you that magnification factor. And it does it separately for X and Y. But again, what you're looking here is like, so 0.57 is sort of shrunk almost half size, just a little more than half size, just under 6/10. And so we're doing it the same. X and Y are joined here. This is also available from the interface. So when you are in Vmix, you can turn around and say, I want my zoom, and that's exactly what you get here when you adjust that. Now, the next things that are in here are not in the interface. Certainly not the way they're shown here. So if we look at that, what we'll look at here, let me just sort of highlight these last elements right here. So X and Y, what you have with these is it's an offset, an actual pixel offset to the start of where that layer paints. And because layers can slide off the screen, partially off the screen, in this case you have sort of a negative number here in your X, and you have a positive number in your Y. And so that's coming against the X is the left-hand side of the screen, and the Y is measured from the top down. So as you move down, the Y increases. As you move to the right, the X increases, and vice versa. If you move up, the Y is decreasing. Move to the left, the X is decreasing. And this is very important because you know the pan. So like you could turn around and say, I have something centered in the screen, but if I scale that thing down, the top corner of it from the X and the Y, that top corner of it actually isn't 0. It's moved. So just by scaling something inside the interface, the X and Y positions move. And that's important because we had to do a lot of calculations around that. And you'll notice that what you see reflected here with width and height is the scaled width and height of that layer. So this here is related to whatever the zoom X and zoom Y you have here. So again, these things are all interrelated. Cropping, which you don't see, like cropping you see more like pixels. You go in so many pixels left and so many pixels right, so many pixels top, so many pixels bottom. That's what the Vmix interface has. But in the programmatic side, what you're seeing in the Vmix XML, it is really just a percentage. Well, not, it's a 0 to 1. So you can sort of say that's sort of 0 to 100%, 0 to 1. And that's what you have here. So how much do I crop in for my, they call it X1. That's your left-hand crop. Because you're also on the X-axis here, your right-hand crop is just a bigger number. So in this case, you'll see that X here is 0.29, so just under 0.3, and the Y is 0.7. So that's just, where you're cropping. What's my crop point along here? But it's a percentage, basically, when you think about it. So you have things now with all of the calculations where you have things that are just sort of scaled. You have things that are related to the size of the scaled object. You have X and Y's, and you have percentages and all of this. So as we go through the script, all of these calculations become really important. And what I want to do is let me just show you how we actually logically work with doing the calculations we do. And this is a pretty good example. So if we call this up here, and this area that you can see clearly, so see there's a little white border around it, that would be your typical person in a box, when you put them in a multi-box shot. So that's what we have here on the screen, where you'd see that. What makes this interesting, though, is that this person is clearly off-centered. So this is not a great shot for this person. So what we actually want to do is we want to take and we want to reframe that. And if we were to reframe this, what we actually are doing is we're turning around and changing the left crop and the right crop to crop the right thing. So now you can see I took from being center cropped. So if we sort of look right before, this basically had the same amount cropped on the left as there was on the right. But when I reframe it, you can now see that I changed the cropping. And so this now is a little bit less on the left and a little bit more over here on the right. But you can still see this is the box that it needs to fit in. So in addition to recropping an image when somebody wants to slide it, we then have to reposition it to make sure that it gets back to being centered. And so you can see now in doing that, I shifted this over, but you can see here in sort of the blurry background, that's the full image. So the X and Y position of where this image has really changed. So it's gone from being sort of centered over here to now shifting all the way over there. So to do that sort of thing where you saw the guest slide back and forth when we were repositioning, what we are actually doing is we are changing the crop and changing the center point. And we're doing that based on a number that we're taking from the dial. So when you turn a dial, we, like you saw in a previous episode, we just read that as a number. We're using that, and that lets us calculate how much of a shift up or down we're going to make. And then everything else you see on screen is happening so quickly that the recrop and the reposition to center it back in the box appears simultaneous. And so you don't have something where you see it slide off and slide back. It is actually just moving to the right position, even though there's a lot of other things that are changing at the same time. So before I jump into the Vmix preset, let me just go back. I think we may have a couple of other questions here. Juan Asri, thank you. Hello there. Good to have you here. Thank you. Blue Chili Productions. Hello. How are you? Thanks for joining. Marco, great to see you here. Thanks. And Junge from Germany, thank you for joining. I appreciate you making the time to join us here on a Friday night. And Michael, yes, Michael's saying that the numbers, it would be too easy if the numbers were all treated the same. Yeah, I'll go into it in the post show, but this was probably the biggest thing that I came into this not expecting. And then when we had to get the math figured out, that took quite a while. So thank you, Michael. Okay, so let me actually jump over and we'll cover the Vmix session that we have here and how the mechanics of all this work. So it's not a very big session, in terms of the number of inputs, but let me talk a little bit about what we're doing. So here in the first two, where I have the adjustment input and the adjustment layer, the way we're working with this is we're using shortcuts inside of Vmix to control the set layer X, set layer Y, and set layer zoom. And you can assign that to any one of the layers, 1 to 10. So that's standard inside Vmix. So what we've done is for the dials inside of the Stream Deck, on the Stream Deck Plus, what we've done is we've mapped those dials to this input layer 1, which is what these first two are. And we're changing the X and Y and zoom on that layer 1. And we're reading that and translating that in basically a delta. Say, okay, how much did I turn the knob, make that adjustment to the target that I want to use. So we have the first two are our adjustment layer, and then whichever input is in preview, that is our target layer. And the way we do this is when we start the script, we grab whoever is in preview. So you want it, the input you're going to adjust while it's in preview. I could then switch it over to program and get something else in preview. And still, because that's the one that I selected, the controls will still work against that input. So I sort of track that input. And then when you stop the script and start it again, it'll pick again whatever is in preview to work on. So that gives you a lot of flexibility production-wise, because you can take and set up if you can't set it up in preview, when you switch it over and you need to make adjustments, you can keep that script running while that multi-box is there and still do the adjustments without locking you out of you putting anything else in preview. So then we have our these two here, which is our border overlay and a blank box. And I'll talk about this a little bit, but it was something we found. When you do zoom and you have a border associated with that layer, so you check the border box in Vmix. If I zoom, the border zooms. So you end up, if you're zooming in like 2 times or 3 times, the border goes from being really thin to being really thick. And let me just show that over here. So if I have these borders here are not overlaid. So if I go here, start my script, and let me go and we'll zoom in on layer 1. Okay, sorry. And something just happened. Give me a second here. I'm sorry about this, guys. Just give me 1 second to make sure I got everything running here. Okay, so I'll just get that running. So if I now am zooming in here, you can see as I zoom in, if you look at the border here, you can see it's getting really thick. So the border adjusts size to the zoom. So all I did here to get this to work is that I took I took basically the same layout. I just copied it from the 4-box, and I put blanks and and put borders around them, and I put that as layer 10. So in this box here, it's just layer 10 with the borders on top. So if you wanted borders, you have to keep in mind that you probably have to do something like that, because borders will zoom. If you don't zoom, if you just want the X adjustment to sort of slide it, it'll work fine, and you can have the baked-in borders already. So that's something that to keep in mind as you do this. So the last thing is we have these multi-box shots that we set up here. And as I said, whatever shot is inside of whatever input is inside a preview, that's what we're going to work on. So that's basically the layout. Then we have a script that we run. And so that script, you start the script, pick the layer, which will typically be one of the guests that you want to adjust. Then you have set X position, set Y position, and set zoom. That's exactly how we're doing all this. So let me I think now what I'd like to do is dive a bit into the script. And I will tell you, this script is fairly large and complex. So it probably makes sense. I have it all posted already in our shared drive. So I'll go through this. I'll try to highlight the key things that we're doing. But this is one of those scripts I think that you're just going to have to take and live with for a bit to understand more of the details. So basically, we set up, to know what our session width and height are. So that's one of the things that aren't in the Vmix XML. Interesting, at least not that I could find. So we just specify that here. And then we just have all of the variables. And the way we're doing things basically is before we make an adjustment, we snapshot what is actually the state, what are all the variables, the crops, the positions, the zooms, all of the above for the target. So what are we starting with? And then what we do is we create all the offsets we need. How do I need to change the X's and the Y's and the crops going forward? Like how much of a change am I making for these things? And from there, I calculate all the new values that I need to assign to that layer using the new shortcuts in Vmix 27. So that's basically everything that you see defined up here. That's what that's all about. And then we have all the XML nodes that we need because we're pulling these things all out individually and working with them. So those are all coming out. This is all XML. So we're pulling all of that out. And then we just do sort of our initial settings for everything that we have here. So, this would be things like what's our target input and the target layer and everything that goes with that. And then the adjustment layer, like because that's what we're reading everything from. So that's all these setups here. These are all the things we need to pull out of the adjustment layer. Some of them are nodes, some of them are integers, some of them are strings or doubles. So all different things, but these are just all the values we're going to use in our calculations. And then we're just turning around and telling it, what's the name of the input that's for my adjustment layer? And we just call it ADJ input. And then I use dynamic value 2 to say which layer do I want to apply the adjustment to in my target layer. So that's sort of where we start. Open the Vmix XML, and we get our target input. So I told you the thing that we're doing before we even go into the loop to process anything is we're saying which Vmix input is in preview. And so we're just pulling that out and assigning that to our target input. And once we have that, then we sort of hang on to that as our target, and we jump into the main loop. And we just keep doing that until it's canceled. So again, you have to keep reloading the Vmix XML because when you load it, it takes a snapshot of it. And so each time we loop, we grab another snapshot of it. It won't change in the background unless you continue to reload it. And again, we're pulling the same thing. What's my target layer? And and convert that to an integer. The reason we convert this to an integer and add 1 is that the target layer, if we are pulling information out of the XML, is going to be 0 based. So your layer 1 is 0, layer 2 is 1, etc. When I want to actually use this in like set layer 1 X, set layer 1 Y, any of that, I need this to be converted to a number. So, and it has to be 1 based. So that's why we do this conversion. I take and I convert the target layer as an integer by upping it by 1. So that gives me everything I can use to apply it to the correct target. And now what we're doing is we're really just starting out and saying, let's take the adjustment layer, and that's what we're reading here, and read that in as an XML node, and we are pulling the position information. So the position information is X, Y, and zoom. So that's the first thing that we're pulling. And and again, this is one of those sort of strange things that you're going to have to get used to in coding. If you have the thing centered perfectly and you haven't made any positional or zoom adjustments, this XML does not exist. So Vmix adds that XML dynamically once there's something changed, but it doesn't have it there by default, sort of with there's no zoom and the X and Y positions are 0. So none of that is there. So when we pull this, it is possible that it's not there. And if it's not there, we actually have to just go and assign values, say the X position and the Y position are 0. We're right up there in the upper left-hand corner. And the zoom value is 1. There's no zoom. So we have to default to that. If it is there, then we have to go and we actually pull the X and Y values to get everything we need about how much we're going to adjust. And we also pull the zoom X. Our assumption, even though it says zoom X, zoom Y, is that you're going to zoom consistently both X and Y. So we're just pulling the 1. And that's a safe assumption. Otherwise, you're distorting things and that wouldn't be right. So this will give you, we just use zoom X as a proxy for the zoom I'm applying to both X and Y. And, then we just have to turn around and say, if there is no zoom, if this layer, if there is no zoom value, then we have to set that to 1. Another thing in Vmix is if I read this, it will give me one set of elements attributes that have all of the X, Y pos. But if there's no zoom change, it doesn't have a zoom value in it. It doesn't have zoom X or zoom Y in there. So I can still have a positional change, but no zoom change. So that's why we're doing all this. This is basically saying if I'm not finding something, make sure it has its default value. And that's what we're doing here. And then we're converting these all to basically doubles or integers for what we want. So we're just pulling the value, the X value, the Y value, which will be basically integers for what we want. And then the zoom value, which is a floating point. So we just treat that as a double. So we have it. But you'll notice, because this is an offset, so if I turn the knob inside of my adjustment layer and I pull these values out, that knob could be moved 2 or 3 notches when I make the turn. So in this case, I just have to grab that X position and that Y position value and convert that to integers. What I'm doing though is it's a delta, because when I make that turn, it's starting from sort of 0 and making an adjustment. So what I want to make sure is I grab that as a delta. For the zoom though, the zoom is going to come back, and if there is no zoom, it's going to come back and say zoom is 1. But if there is a zoom, a little down or a little up, what I want to know is I want a vector. I want to say, is the zoom, am I zooming down or am I zooming up? Sort of zooming into something, which is up, or pulling out from something, which is down. So what I have to do is I have to subtract 1, because if I'm zooming to 1.1, 1.2, the delta, the vector that I'm looking for, is the 0.1 or 0.2. And that's what you get by subtracting the 1. So that's the logic behind this here. And so I'm doing now the same with all the things I get for my target layer. So going in there, I'm pulling the zoom values. And again, it's the same things. If these things don't exist, if X, these are not found, then I have to go and just set all the defaults. Otherwise, I just pull the value that's there. So when I go through all the target information, and it's pretty close to exactly what we just did with the adjustment information, what I now have at this point when I've gone through is this is where it is right now. That's sort of what I call my previous. So all these things, my previous X position, my previous Y, because I know I'm going to change it. So that's the previous one. I have all those, and I have the deltas that I just took out of the adjustment layer. So at this point, I have what I need, and now I just need to apply it. So what we're going to do here is well, actually, I was wrong. We have all we need for X, Y, and zoom. What I also need, though, is I need all the crop values. because I need to know how cropped in top and bottom this is. So very similarly, I'm going in and saying, let's find if this is cropped. We're going to basically go and pull all the crop values out. Otherwise, if there's no cropping that's taken place on the target, we don't do anything. So that was just a message we print. In the off case, it's there. So we know that we're basically, we now have sort of all the data we need to get started. So if, what we want to do then is say, if there is a zoom value, if we've made a zoom adjustment in the adjustment zoom value, so we're saying if it's not 0, then we want to go and take the new zoom, and it's going to be the previous zoom plus this adjustment. And remember, that adjustment is sort of -1, so it's either I'm incrementing it off of what the previous zoom or decrementing it, but that's my new zoom. And the other thing that I have to check, and we're going to do this all through, is zoom goes from 0 to 5 inside of Vmix. So I have to make sure that if I've turned this knob and made a calculation, so sort of I dropped the zoom below 0 because it was at 0, or a very low number, and I turned it and it dropped below 0. I just have to reset to say, if you're below the minimum, bang it to the minimum. So that sort of puts a bracket on the bottom, and we do the same on the upper end. So if I turned it up and I went above 5 on the zoom, again, I do the same thing here. I just go and say, lock it into 5. So that gives us bumpers on both sides as we do the zoom. And so what we have to do, though, when we've talked about the zoom, and this is, there's a lot of math that we had to figure out here to get this to work. But basically, when I zoom into something, what I need to do, because if you remember, I said the crop is a percentage of the basic image. It's not based on zoom at all. So it's going how much of the original image is cropped. So when I zoom in, I need to change that crop to keep it in whatever box it was in initially. So what I'm doing here is I have to say, what's the difference between the new zoom and the previous zoom? Well, how much of a change is it? And then I have to figure out, now I'm not going to go into all of the details, but what we're basically doing is we're finding the right percentage that we need to adjust the crop when I zoom in. So if I zoom in and it would sort of extend out over the box, I then have to go and say, let me move my X's in. So my 1X gets bigger, the right X gets smaller, the top gets bigger, the bottom gets smaller to keep that crop size. So even though I'm doing the zoom visually, because we're doing the cropping dynamically, as we do this, we keep that zoomed image inside the box on screen. And we also, in doing this, we have to maintain sort of the center point, which is, basically zoom works along a, up from the center. So you have that center point typically stays whole, and this gives you exactly what you need. But again, because you're calculating this, you're calculating this as percentages, but you're still working with pixels and percentages. So a lot of this is just to rationalize all of that. Again, this would be too much to go to in a live show, but all this code is there with all the comments. So that should make it easier. And so like we talked about before, we have to make sure that the crops stay within, where they belong. And if we want to, once we have this, if we sort of go off, I know I'm done. I've done everything I need to because I can't zoom in anymore or zoom out anymore. If the right crop is greater than 1, then it's just set it to 1. And I apply everything to sort of my defaults. I just turn around and say the zoom is 1 and the crops are layer 1X and Y are 0. So just put it back to where the beginning, because there is no crop on this anymore. So we've done this. And again, I don't want to sort of belabor everything, but we're doing this for the left crop, the right crop, the bottom crop, and the top crop. We're doing the same sort of thing. We're just making sure it fits in whatever we zoom to, and that's all there. And when we're done, we basically are saying, okay, I just I've processed everything and applied it that I need to for the zoom. And so that's, right now I have all the values and everything set. And that's our first thing. So we sort of handle the zoom. And then, we have the new X and Y positions based on the zoom. So if you remember, when I zoom something in or out, the X and Y's are going to change. So all of that, like where do I reposition it? All of that has to happen here as well. And again, it's really just too much time to go through the math in detail, but we're just basically creating a vector that says, how much did the image grow? It's sort of a scalar offset. So this is how much did the image grow in the X direction, and then we calculate the new offset in the new X position based on that. And the same for the Y position, which just is repositioning this. And when we're done, we've done all of these sort of general calculations, we come here and we just apply it all. So this is if we did the zoom, we just go and say, zoom in, put the new X and Y's, because it changed that. And we then have to say we want the new crops, and we set the new zoom, and we're done. So when we snap this, basically what we're doing is getting this all set. And for everything that we're doing here, that's really it. We make all our calculations, and then at the end, we process this and say, let's snap this. So this is everything for the zoom. We do the same thing here. This is sort of the else clause. If we're either zooming or repositioning, we're doing all of the same basic things here, but this time doing it with the X and Y positions. And I showed that in that diagram where we just sort of recrop and reposition. That's exactly what we're doing here. And if you look, one of the things that we, like I mentioned, you saw this up in the previous one, every time we go through making an adjustment, what we're doing back to the adjustment layer is we're snapping it back to its default. Because the adjustment layer, we're not copying the value in the adjustment layer. We're trying to create a delta. So sort of, where am I? So if I start from my default values all the time, that gives me that delta. So when I get a new value, I know that it's sort of against my originals, 1 for zoom, 0 for X and Y. And so that's everything that we're doing here. So that's why when you see me do these things here with the, locking, putting bumpers around the crops or the zooms, all of that, once I hit that, I just go back and say, okay, and I'm done. I can't do anymore. So just reset my adjustment layer. And then when we do the loop again, we look at the new delta from the default. So that should make it, I know this isn't a clear topic, but that should make it a little clearer, some of the logic behind this. The adjustment layer is always just a delta, and at the end of each loop, we reset the adjustment layer to be just its default values. So again, we're doing all the stuff with the left crop, right crop, where if it's too big, too small, we bump it to the minimum or the maximum, reset the adjustment layer, and we keep going. Bottom crop, top crop, exactly the same thing here. Now, the calculation we have to do when we do the cropping, if you remember when I showed the image, we sort of crop it, and then we have to recenter it in the box. And that's everything that we're calculating here. So this depends on what's the zoom and how much are we shifting this. But it's basically, this is the basic calculation. We're sort of finding the center point and then figuring out based on the change how that translates into the X offset and the Y offset. And that's basically all we're doing here with you sort of find the middle of your crops, and if you shifted it, how did that center point change? And let's use that as our offset. That's all we're doing. You saw me do that visually on the diagram, but that's all these calculations are doing. And then we are basically going there and we are applying the X, Y, and the pan X, pan Y, sort of moving it around, and then the crop. And that's how we basically are handling the, if you think about exactly what we're doing, you just sort of slide it back. That's the panning. And then the cropping is the percents in. And so that's what we've done. And once that's all set, as I said, we reach the end of the loop and we go back here, reset everything in the adjustment layer back to its defaults, pause for 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second, and go back and do the loop. So I do not expect that based on that walkthrough, this is all 100% clear. But the core premise should be that what we are doing here is playing with the crops and the positions, and based on whether we're zooming or sliding, we use that as a basis for sort of reworking the crops and the positioning to make sure it stays in its fixed position on the screen with the fixed boundaries of whatever box it was in before we touched it. And that's what we're doing with all of these. And that gives us a huge amount of power when you think about it, because we can now take knobs and just slide the guest up, down, left, right, and zoom in or zoom out. And that is very intuitive. So even though the code is very far from intuitive, the actual operation of this, I mean, if you look, let me just show the control again for the Stream Deck here. If you look at this, it really is a very simple mechanism here. So let me sort of just, so all I'm doing here is I have the three knobs for my zoom, my X, my Y, and my X position. And so just turning that makes the adjustment. And then I just pick the layer I want to do it on. And I can start it or stop the adjustment. And that means that if I want to pick and have a new input adjusted, I can actually just go and do that. So if I had this, so he's over here, I'm going to start this here. So if I want to then sort of cut this over, and I'm going to, so you can see it's still hanging on here. And if I then wanted to say, okay, this looks good, I could go and add this now over here. If you see now, when I turn this knob, it's still over here. But if I stop the script and then start the script again, it will now pick up this in here. So if I am moving, you can see now the adjustment is happening to the input here. So a lot of flexibility in a very, very simple interface for managing. Since I have this set up to do 6 layers, there's lots of different ways you could do this, to do more. But I thought this as a UI for controlling framing inside of a multi-box shot was fairly straightforward and something that a lot of people could use. So this, by the way, this as a script, this will work basically on any framework you have. It doesn't require this preset. If I took this script and I ran it on something which had all of your own multi-box shots set up, it would just work. Again, the caveat is if you're using borders and you do zoom, the borders will zoom with the zoom. But outside of that, for X and Y positioning, this would work fine. And it means that you don't have to sort of conform to what I set up in my preset to use the script. Okay, so I know this was a fairly long show, and I know that was really a very, very brief code overview for something that is effectively a very complex set of math that has to be done. But the code's all up there, so you should be able to grab it and dive into it yourself if you so choose, or just run it. Either way. So before we wrap up the show and go to the post show, let me just see if there are a few more comments we have here. So Samurai is asking, can I assume that you can use a Stream Deck XL and map and increment or decrement to additional keys? Yes, you can. You would need different code for this because the increment and decrement is using the dial to actually do that. You would have to readjust this so you sort of have a plus minus, and if I were doing this, what I would probably do is I'd probably set it up so you had sort of plus 10, plus 5, plus 1, minus 10, minus 5, minus 1. And that way you could do big jumps across to sort of move things quickly and then dial it in using the sort of +5, +1 or -5, -1 to zone in on what you want. But that would basically replace the code we had around the adjustment layer. But you're still doing the same general type of thing here. Different logic for like you don't reset the adjustment layer for you now. You sort of have to sort of keep that, track that yourself as you're doing it. And when you jump to another layer, you'd have to know what you did there. But it should basically work with just the Stream Deck XL. So let's see. So JP is saying we often have to cut away, then quickly move the guest. Any suggestions how you would tie this into keyboard arrows or X keys? So yeah, I mean, that was basically just what I'm saying. You'd have to rewrite parts of this so that it would work with a delta that you're just like pumping into this as you did this. But that could probably work as a fairly straightforward thing where every time you push the key, it sort of adds the delta, it applies it, and then resets it to 0, and you go from there. So definitely something that I think you could do with the keyboard, just some changes to the code. So Juan Edward is saying, could I create a carousel with the zoom entries using scripts? So what was the best way to create a carousel of entries? So if by that you mean something where I can sort of zoom out the middle layer and have the sort of side layers be smaller, and then as I move things across the screen, left or right, I sort of pop them into the bigger layer in the middle and zoom into that. You can do that. What I would suggest if you wanted to do something like that is if you look at the last show that we did, where I can create multi-box layouts using XML. If I wanted to do this as a carousel, what I would do is I would create different layouts. So I basically have sort of, this is my large center and then a smaller item and then a still smaller item, sort of my guest trailing off. And I would always prepare the next element, the next layout based on the current layout. So I'd look and say, okay, if I have guest 1 and 2 to the left-hand side, guest 3 is big because that's the one I'm talking about in my carousel. And then 4 and 5 are my smaller elements in the carousel going the other way. I would use something I create dynamically on the other side to say, okay, now let's take and we'll shift everything. So now my 2 smaller ones in preview are going to be 2 and 3. The center is going to be 4, and the right hand would be 5 and 6. So like I'm shifting, going from 1, 2, 3 big, 4, 5 to 2, 3, 4 big, 5, 6. And what this will do is if you do a merge between those two, it'll actually take and slide this sort of directionally, whichever way you want to go. So this means that you could create a carousel effect by just dynamically building the next or the previous layout that you want. But that would definitely work. And it could actually be a pretty cool looking type of thing, especially if you're sort of going through and introducing large panels or different topics where you want to sort of go through, this is going to be everything we're doing at our conference today, and sort of go through all of the speakers or all of the subjects. You could do something that would have that sort of nice visual glide back and forth with the zoom ins and zoom outs. So that would be probably my recommendation for how to do that. But, it can be done, and it can actually look really nice. And if you just said, which one do I want to be on, and use the knob to do that, to sort of slide left and right, that you could do. But again, there's a lot of complex stuff then you're starting to get into where you're tracking. But the first show, like 2 shows ago, we did something where you just read a value from a knob to go through graphics. So you could use something like that, and then use what we did in last show, where you create these independently to create layouts independently just using XML to sort of drive the next piece of this and combine those two. Sort of similar to what we did today with concepts. But yes, you could make it happen. Sorry if that was a very long answer. So, all right. So JP is saying it took us a while to figure out the zoom, pan, and crop increments. Yeah, and they are much smaller when you hold a control key. That is true. So that is a way, and it took me a while to find that out too. So you're not alone on that. That gives you, when you're working with the interface itself, it's sort of the Vmix UI. When you hold that and you make those adjustments, it does make them happen at a much more controllable level when you're really trying to dial something in. So, Judd, did you see a need for a reset button for all these movements? You could. I mean, so to make that happen, what I need to have is something where I capture all of these layouts, and I can restore them back to what they were initially if I needed to. And again, this sort of comes back to what we did last time in our last show, where we were using XML to control the layout. If you do something like that, where you turn around and say, I actually can assign a layout to any input, and you use that, that would give you that reset capability where I can just go back and say, I'm just going to read this XML and apply it to that input, and everything will be exactly the way it was. So that would probably be something you could use as a reset. Again, I did these sort of as a series of shows with Vmix 27 beta, because all of these concepts are interrelated. And I think that's something that definitely could be a possibility to create the reset capability. The other thing you could do, if you wanted something that's lower scale, is at the beginning, at the same place where I pull what input is in preview and what's my target input, that those two things that I'm using conceptually, if I took, before I go into my main loop, if I grabbed all of the values from my target input, so and copy them, so I had sort of my reset X, Y, XPOS, YPOS, zoom, and all my crops, I could somewhere inside that loop, if I needed to, I could have a reset button that said, take all those values that you grabbed at the very beginning before you started making changes, pull them, and apply them to the target input. And that's another way you could do that, but that only works if you haven't switched off and gone to another thing to make an adjustment. So two different ways to approach that, but both of them could work. So let's see. Sean is saying, I tried to roll back to 26 due to some issues, nothing but green screen video output. I'm not sure. I can tell you one thing that I found with this, and it could be totally unrelated. We had the same issue with the application VLC if you were using, I believe it was if you were using your hardware encoding for certain things, where it just would put out all green as an output. I am not sure though. I've never seen this specifically with Vmix, but that definitely sounds like some sort of potential color space issue, or something where it's definitely processing the video frames incorrectly. So I would just check on some of the things. I mean, it's possible what I'd probably do is update your graphics drivers. That would be the first thing. The other thing is, this could potentially be something where you're asking Vmix to use an encode, but you don't have enough encodes left on your graphics card. So if you're using a GTX graphics card, I think you now have 5 encodes you can get on that. So if you were trying to do, like you're doing multiple records, ISO chords or something, and they're all using encoders, you may have been telling it to use hardware encoding, but it didn't have a hardware encoder available. Again, I'm just pulling stuff, but I think the good place to start is to really just update your graphics drivers for that, because I've been using Vmix 27 now for oh gosh, probably about 3 weeks solid, without any issues like that. The issues I'm finding are really esoteric issues with like resetting values in XML and stuff like that. So nothing that I saw visually that would have impacted a production. And they've been updating it fairly regularly, and fairly frequently for a beta release. They usually don't have that many rollouts, but I think there's a lot of foundational things changed in here. So I would definitely give it a try again. I've not had this, but change your drivers and I'd give it a try again and see if that makes a difference. So, yeah, Marco's asking if anybody's having drop frames using Vmix desktop capture and Vmix 27. I have not, and I've used it. I've been using it for doing demos as well, because now that we're sort of a lot more comfortable with it. So I have not seen that yet, where it was dropping frames, but I haven't been looking at that critically. So there definitely could be something going on that I just haven't seen. So this is something I'd have to look into, but I haven't seen it in an obvious way. Well, look, before we get on to more comments yet, I think we're probably at a good point to wrap up the show, and we can jump into the post show, and then we'll just keep going back and forth with any comments you have and anything you want me to talk about. So why don't we do that? If you can't join us for the post show, I know this has been a long show already. I want to thank you all for watching, and we will see you next Friday with another show. If you can, I'll see you in a few minutes. So until then, take care, everyone. All right, everybody, welcome to the post show. This was a really crazy episode that I put together, and so Omega Radio saying your videos teach us a lot. I thank you. I appreciate that. There's so much that we can do sort of as a community to sort of maximize the use of the tools we have. So yeah, I think. Anything that we share, I'm a big believer in just sort of share what you know, and it will come back to you. That's people have done that for me, so always happy to do that going forward. Marco is saying he thinks it may be a cabling issue. Yeah, I'm not sure, Marco. This is something that you could look there. You can have stuff if you're pulling it in from a system that may be a little overloaded at certain times, or something where you can get drop frames. Anything like NDI, any IP-based capture can have that if the system's loaded, but it could be something, cabling potentially as well. So, it could be something that's impacting how it's reading off of the memory buffer inside the graphics card. Okay. So thank you for sticking with me. This was a fairly long and in a lot of ways a very tedious show. I'll talk a bit about that. When I started putting this together, I had the general concept where I said, okay, you just sort of, because I kind of just crop and zoom and exposition. I said, okay, this is just going to be where I'll just do slide arounds and just make quick adjustments. When I got into this, the technical details on all of this became really challenging because there's sort of all these different coordinate spaces I'm working in and coordinate units and moving between them. So this was something that I thought, to be honest, I thought this was going to be like a day of scripting and then put the show together from there. This almost took 3 days, and is really, if I hadn't committed to do it, and sort of in my head, I probably would have walked away from this one. It really just took a tremendous amount of time, and in all honesty, I needed to tap on the development resources we had here to walk through the math calculations for all this stuff to make sure we could get this right, because it was a real challenge. So that's why, when I put this here, and it's funny because I actually talked to one of the engineers, Matt, that I talked through all this with on the setting this up for the math part of it, and he had to stop and rethink how these calculations were done. So as we were discussing, because I want to make sure I could at least cover it in a reasonable way for the show. But so yeah, this is not something you easily can hold in your head. It's sort of, you have to put things on paper and lay them all out and copy values and then figure out all the math. So I totally understand if you looked at this and said, oh, I may just run this and not really worry about what's inside it. I would totally understand that. That's why I tried to make it a little more generic, so you could just use it on any input, and with layers, and it would work the same way, so you don't have to know too much about it. The only thing you'd really need to do is, if you're working in 720p, you'd need to change the variables right at the beginning that said, what are my session X and session Y resolutions? But that would be it. So JP is saying, does anyone else use an Elgato capture card? We tried it recently, but it seems to need to run gaming software versus BM Intensity, which just works. Yeah, I haven't used the Elgato capture cards. We use mostly the Stream Decks and the lighting here, but everything else, we haven't really used. So definitely, this could be something that if somebody else here knows, please just post it for JP, because I don't have a good answer for you. But we do use Blackmagic, and that, I agree with that. That just seemed to work, just sort of out the box. So Michael's saying, an idea for an upcoming Vmix 27 beta show, the new stuff on audio. Vmix show mentioned a lot of different issues on that in the November show. Yeah, I mean, there may be what may make sense, because I looked at that, and there are a lot of changes sort of under the hood, but they don't translate into as many sort of operational changes. But that probably makes sense if I want to do a wrap up on Vmix 27 beta, cover some of the things that are really different, that have an impact on how you can configure presets and productions. So thank you, Michael. I think that would be definitely something to take a look at. So Aziz is asking, does this also work with some other device? So right now we set this up to work with the Stream Deck Plus. There were a couple of other people asking about, could you make it work with like arrow keys or other things? So if I wanted to do that, so let me actually pop into the code again for a second, so I could sort of show you everything that we're doing. So if I come in here, everything that I have here is all the things that I do for the adjustment layer. So I'm pulling this out of an adjustment, an input that has a layer on it that I use, and I manipulate that to do the adjustments. And so if there is no adjustment, I reset that, and we did all this stuff. Everything that I'm doing here, though, is really coming at this to say, I need to extract the values that I'm going to use, basically, like what you see here. These are the values that so my adjustment values. Everything else that I'm doing then affects the target and what I do. But these are the three. I'm pulling a change in X, a change in Y, and a change in zoom. So those are the three values. So this one chunk of code is where all of that is happening. Right here, pull out the adjustment information. If you ignored everything else and basically said, I'm going to come in here and make these adjustments using a keyboard, where I will look there and say, like if there's something I could capture in Vmix, I can sit there and say, okay, just increment by, 1, 2, or 3, or whatever you want to do different things. If you did that and just came out of here with these values in place that you need, sort of this calculation at the end, you would be able to do what you need to. Now, the other piece here is that because that's a delta, like when I do the increment, I keep resetting them back to their default values. You would need to do the same thing. So everywhere else where you would see I'm just turning around and resetting the adjustment values, that's in different places through the code. Like some of these things in here where I just go, so these things here, like if the crops are off, I just reset all the adjustment values. If I'm past the top or below, the bottom of the crops, and you'd have to, where I have all of these, you would have to go and reset your values as well. So you could, without understanding a lot of the detail in the code, you could actually make this work in a very similar way using just a keyboard or a touchpad. It will require some modification, though, to do that, but those are really the places you need to do it to get this to work. Okay. All right. So I know this was has been a pretty long show, but hopefully you found this useful. And I think Michael's point of sort of doing one more show where we can wrap up some of these other changes. I mean, everybody knows about the Zoom, and there's plenty of stuff out there for Zoom. So that's not something I necessarily need to cover. That's been sort of covered pretty broadly. But going over some of the loose ends in the beta that could be interesting. I'll see if there's a show I could pull together around all of that and make that work. So let's see. Aziz has some suggestions for other topics. So changing outputs dynamically, PTZ camera controlling, green screen keying. So let's see. So yes, it's funny. Changing outputs dynamically. This is one of those things where let me jump over to the Vmix screen and show you something. If I want to go in let me just click on settings, and I want to create a shortcut. So just sort of go here, and I'll add a new shortcut. And I want to turn around and say, forget what I assign it to. I want to go change output. So the set output, I believe here. I can set output 2, 3, and 4. I can't set output 1. And this is something that there were cases where I actually want to change what's going out that main output, but I can't. So I don't know why. There may be some optimization that is going on, or they may just figure that it's, it doesn't really matter because that's just going to be whatever I switch to program anyway. But there were times I wanted to do that, and I can't. So this is something that you can. It's just in your set output. You have 2, 3, and 4, so you can set that, and you can also do the same for the externals. External 2, again, you can't touch 1, but this is just things you can do in the scripting already. But so it is there. But yeah, there were some good suggestions in there for controlling cameras, and we really haven't done a show on green screening in quite a while. And I think that could be another interesting show, maybe to wrap up the year. So let me think through that. But thank you, Aziz, because there's really some good suggestions there. So Michael, so yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Like I said, this isn't the easiest show to communicate live. But I'm glad you stuck with me for everybody that sort of made it through all of this. And the code is there. So hopefully this is something, once you pull it down, you'll get to spend time with it, and it'll make more sense. So Automation, thank you for joining us. Definitely appreciate it. So, all right then. I think we are probably at a good endpoint for the show. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for hanging out for the post show. And we are planning a show next Friday. So I hope to see you all there. And until then, be safe, be well. Take care.